Welcome everyone. My name is Tristan Claridge and I'm the convener of this webinar series for the International Social Capital Association. The association's mission is to advance the research and application of the social capital concept, and the association is welcoming new members. In this session, we welcome Associate Professor Jill Duncan and Dr. Tim Byatt for a presentation about the buffering effects of social capital in young people who are deaf or hard of hearing. We've been unable to organise a sign language interpreter for this session. However, automatic captions are available in Zoom. If you would like to enable captions in Zoom, in the meeting control bar, click on the Show Captions icon. The icon looks like a CC, two-letter Cs. You'll also be able to set your speaking language and adjust the size of the captions. I'll also post these instructions in the chat in Zoom, so anyone can access them. Before I hand over to our presenters, I'll briefly introduce them. Associate Professor Jill Duncan serves as an academic in the University of Newcastle School of Education and the University Lead Equity, Diversity and Inclusion. She also serves as an advisor to the New South Wales and Australian governments related to people with disability and the intersectional disadvantages women encounter. She is a non-executive director of the Aussie Deaf Kids. She has a long history of investigating the influence of social capital on the developing deaf child. And Jill has a permanent conductive hearing loss since early adolescence and uses an implanted device to augment her hearing ability. Dr. Tim Byatt is a casual academic at the University of Newcastle School of Education and works full-time for the Department of Education in a teacher hearing support role in Sydney. He was awarded a PhD in 2023 that involved publishing 4 peer-reviewed articles related to social capital and identity in adolescents who are deaf or hard of hearing, and its association with other factors such as social communication and well-being. He has been working in deaf education for 16 years and has an additional 5 years experience in a mainstream high school teacher. Additionally, he has moderate hearing loss and identifies as deaf. We are delighted that you've agreed to give this webinar. Welcome, Jill and Tim, and over to you for the presentation.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Tristan. It is our pleasure to be with you this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are. Before I begin, I'd like to disclose that there are no conflicts of interest associated with any of the research that we will be presenting to you today. However, the J&K Wonderland Foundation funded study 2 and study 3 of the works that we'll be sharing with you. The outline for the presentation today starts with an acknowledgement of country, and I shall do that before I go any further. So I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we are all meeting today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. We'll do, although Tristan has already introduced us, we'll just briefly go over a few items for you. And then we'll cover social capital theoretical frameworks, which I am sure most certain that you all are very familiar with. We'll do a bit of an introduction to deafness because it will help set the context for the research that we'll be sharing with you. We will talk about the outcomes of deaf youth. All the participants in the 3 studies that we'll be sharing with you are deaf youth. So we have 3 studies that we will share. Tim's will cover study 1, and then I will cover study 2 and 3. I'll briefly go over what we're hoping to do in terms of our future research, and then Tim will close with a summary. So Tim and I, as Tristan mentioned, are affiliated with the University of Newcastle. We are in the College of Human and Social Futures, and we teach in the School of Education, primarily focusing on the education of deaf children. So what we do primarily is we teach teachers how to teach deaf children. I also have a dual role. I serve as university lead, equity, diversity, and inclusion.
I'm going to give a brief overview now of our social capital theory. We use two theorists, Putnam and Bourdieu. I'm not going to go into great detail about the theory, as I would be pretty sure most of you would be familiar with it, but I do want to use our rationale here while we use them. So we know that Putnam predominantly uses trust and reciprocity to measure social capital, and we use these same measures. We did do a separate quantitative survey using an instrument with trust and reciprocity, which is not part of today's presentation. However, it was also useful in the qualitative analysis. Bonding social capital was theorized to come from in the first study at least, the young participants' families. And bridging social capital was seen to come from outside of the family. That might be membership in sporting organisations, places of worship, or indeed within school. Putnam predominantly sees social capital as generally positive, which contrasts a little bit with Bourdieu, which I'll go through in a moment. And Putnam also views social capital as essentially an unlimited resource. Again, a slight difference there with Bourdieu. Very useful to our use of social capital theory with Putnam was Putnam's concept of having a good balance of bonding and bridging social capital. So the idea there is if we have too much bonding social capital, that can make our worldview quite insular and can put up large barriers to entry. If we have too much bridging social capital to the detriment of bonding social capital, that can make our relationships perhaps too superficial. So we are very much hoping to see in our research a balanced bonding and bridging social capital. Moving on to Bourdieu. Now, as I'm sure you all understand, Bourdieu does not look at social capital in isolation, but rather as one in a set of capitals, if you like, predominantly social and cultural capital, which can further be subdivided, which I won't go into now. But one of the key differences between Bourdieu and Putnam, as I already mentioned, is that Bourdieu views social capital or capital as a group as being a finite resource. In other words, those who have that capital are protecting it, and those who don't have it are in the field trying to further gain a greater position, partially through the use of social and cultural capital. The other key difference is that it's a finite resource, whereas Putnam, to my knowledge, doesn't put limits on the extent and use of social capital. I want to talk for a few minutes about the context of deafness. So deafness is a broad term. It can affect the inner ear, particularly cochlear hair cells, and it may affect the predominantly middle ear. There are other types of hearing loss, but the two main types of hearing loss are middle and inner hair cell damage. It may be temporary or permanent, and it may be treated with the use of hearing aids, or typically for mild to moderate hearing loss. And increasingly in developed nations, cochlear implants are used for severe to profound hearing loss. In terms of prevalence, the World Health Organization tells us that there are approximately 430 million people with significant hearing loss. And in Australia, approximately 1 in 6 people would have hearing loss. But these figures are concentrated in certain populations, particularly over 60, 70 years of age, the numbers go up significantly. And in Australia, amongst Indigenous populations, there is an epidemic of hearing loss, particularly conductive hearing loss, which affects the middle ear and, if not treated, can be permanent. Amongst children, well, firstly, babies, you might have 1 or 2 diagnosed with significant hearing loss in 1,000. And a little bit older, that will go up to about 3 in the 9 to 16-year-old age group. So universal newborn hearing screening does pick up many babies with hearing loss, but there's also an element that it doesn't pick up due to hearing loss developing in the first few years of life. So it's important at this point to note that not everyone would view deafness as a disability. I'm going to talk further later on about the idea of identity, which was key to, I think, all of our studies, but particularly the first study that I'm going to be discussing. But the idea of capital D deaf, which is very prevalent and dominant in the United States and also in Australia in certain sections, these people who belong to this community do not view deafness as a disability rather than as a difference. And when you see deaf generally spelled with a capital D, it is generally saying people who classify themselves as deaf, and it's a community. It's a linguistic community, but it's also a cultural community. In terms of some of the outcomes for those in Australia and other developed nations, excuse me, as I mentioned previously, the universal newborn hearing screening, which in the state in which Jill and I live, has been at pretty much 100% or 99+% since 2002. So most children who have hearing loss, it would be picked up, or most babies, it would be picked up in the first few days of life, and then hopefully in a rescreen at preschool age if it's acquired later on. Those who do require cochlear implantation, it's very common in Australia for babies to be implanted with 2 cochlear implants if needed before the age of 12 months. Other countries, it may well be later. And jumping down to that historical point, when we look back at the data from 30, 40 years ago, very old research now, it was not uncommon for students, or deaf students, to not exceed a 4th grade reading level at the end of their schooling. That is no longer common today. That is older research. So a combination of early detection in hospitals, early fitting of devices, improved technology with hearing aids, digital hearing aids, and more availability of cochlear implants, for example, better early intervention. All these things have worked together to dramatically improve the outcomes of young people who are deaf. However, the outcomes are not commensurate with what we would term the typically hearing population. There is still a gap there, and students with hearing loss continue to lag in language scores, but are within 1 standard deviation. So that's a better result, but not the desired result. In terms of mental health, children who are deaf are certainly 2 to 4 times more likely to experience mental health issues. And of course, this is very difficult to just say as one blanket statement. Of course, we are aware there are different types of school placements and different contexts as well. Also, we should say at this point that approximately, I mean, depending on how you measure it, 25 to 40% of children and actually adults as well would have an additional disability if they have deafness. Now that might be, for example, part of a syndrome, or it could be any number of things, but it is not unusual for someone who has a diagnosis of deafness to have an additional disability. Jill, your microphone's muted.
I didn't want you to hear my coughing. In terms of post-secondary outcomes, which is primarily my research at the moment, although I have quite a bit of research on deaf adolescents, what we're finding is that the post-secondary outcomes lag those of the general population. And in Australia, shockingly, only 58% of deaf adults are employed. So that's a huge gap. And we know that the employment gap between deaf and typically hearing people decreases as educational attainment increases, which indicates, of course, the importance of post-secondary education for a more equitable employment level for our deaf young people. And so, you know, Tim spoke about the universal newborn hearing screening, early amplification or technology, early intervention, support in primary school, support in secondary school. He spoke about how individuals who are deaf, young people who are deaf, are making progress as we improve technology and improve our pedagogical strategies. However, when they get to secondary school and they seek employment or seek to enter university, higher education, they plummet. Very few deaf and hard of hearing young people enter employment or tertiary education. And so it was our hypothesis that this is related to social capital. It's related to their ability to hear and use social language, and also to leverage the social language to build their social capital. That's our interest in what the social capital of high achieving deaf people and also of adolescent youth.
So my study is entitled Social Capital. When I say my study, Jill and Dr. Kerry Daly are also co-authors, is entitled Social Capital and Identity of Deaf Adolescents, an Interpretive Phenomenological Analysis. I will state at this point that we're using the term here D/deaf, which might seem a bit strange if you haven't come across that before. The reason we have decided to use that terminology in this article is because it is respectful of the deaf community, the capital D deaf signing community, but it also acknowledges that we are including those people who might call themselves deaf but not be formally associated with the capital D deaf community. So the research questions that we addressed are, we're looking at the social capital experience of deaf adolescents. In particular, we hoped to get a good sample of the lived experience from these participants, deaf adolescents, who are underrepresented in the research. We're looking at what factors hinder and what factors facilitate this generation of social capital. And key to this study is identity formation, which I will talk more about as we go. So as I mentioned earlier, it's IPA is the chosen qualitative analysis tool used here. Usually with phenomenological research, the researcher will bracket or put aside their own opinions and lived experience. IPA turns this on its head a little bit, particularly with the analysis part, and having semi-structured questions allowed me to phrase certain questions as they came up, using some of my own lived experience as a deaf person. So we interviewed 10 high school students and 10 of their parents. And all of these students use spoken language. They were interviewed over Zoom. As I mentioned, we use a semi-structured format and a first and second inferential coding analysis. With this coding analysis, obviously there's more information in the article, but initially came up with 92 structural codes, and that was combined down to 51 descriptive codes, until finally we had 4 themes with 11 sub-themes. Now, I'm obviously not going to go through all of that today, but the information, if you really want to find detail, is in the article. So talking about bonding social capital, you will remember that we theorised that these adolescents would have high bonding social capital, and that's what it turned out to be. The adolescents use language such as it's just a given that they're accepted. They had shared values with their parents. And this level of understanding really germinated, I suppose, from their parents understanding their own experiences as young deaf people. So that was really pivotal to developing that bonding social capital, that sense of understanding. For example, parents would sometimes speak about how they were aware at a crowded family function that it was difficult for their child to hear. And one parent spoke to me how she would actively facilitate that conversation without being too controlling, and help her child, for example, to sit in the middle of the table where it was easier for her to access the conversation. So there's an awareness of deafness there as well. Some did express some difficulty with their experience of deafness, and one participant, and I do stress this is just 1 out of 10, it's really hard when you're deaf. Exactly. People think you're different, so they're trying to trust someone else is really hard. So you learn to keep everything private in your life. So I'm afraid to go to my parents. So this is a contradictory single case finding that is different from most of the ones that we did talk about earlier. Social capital at school, as you can imagine, was a key talking point. It was often linked with a positive academic or social, sporting experience. For example, one boy, or 2 children actually, were high achievers. A number of them were involved in elite sports programming. So this is a convenient sample. We took people who were eligible for the study, and these are the sample that we received. 2 of the adolescents had moved schools to find a better fit. And the idea of social capital being generated through the school providing the right support. So when I say right support, it's a number of things that I do in my main job as a teacher of the deaf. For example, understanding how to use the hearing technology, the assistive technology in the classroom, setting up a learning environment for these deaf adolescents to be successful learners, and understanding and facilitating that sense of connection with other students within the class. There, 8 of 10 did experience difficulties at school, with some being more extreme than others. So some moved schools. 5 of 10 actually experienced quite negative experiences that would be classified as bullying or perhaps even discrimination. So talking about one of those particularly difficult experiences, one mother spoke about how her deaf daughter was actively discouraged from joining the band because the teacher, the implication there was that the teacher didn't want this particular girl bringing down the quality of the band because they had been prejudged as being deaf and not able to be able to join the band and be successful in that environment. There are other examples there as well. One particular parent, and this is not an example of discrimination, but it's perhaps a misunderstanding of deafness. One parent spoke about how her daughter's school put her in a box as a kid that needed looking after. So in that way, they were limited in the way they could develop her positive deaf identity, which a big part of that is being seen as someone who's capable, being able to self-advocate and increasingly work towards independence, being an independent young adult. I love this quote because I think it encapsulates a lot of the themes from this study. One participant spoke about how he's just a normal person, but with a bit of deafness. So the term normal here is not something that we typically use in academia or professional and polite circles. It's a bit of a faux pas. But what I loved about this study is that I was able to use a participant's words. It wasn't sugar-coated and it wasn't sophisticated. But I think the inference there is that this particular child wanted to be understood. And the role of social capital there is developing his understanding and develop his connection with other networks. And as he joined those networks, hearing or his deafness became just one part of that identity. So I'm going to talk just for a couple of minutes now about what I mean by deaf identity. We did publish a previous study, a scoping review on deaf identity. So roughly speaking, and historically, there have been 4 classifications of deaf identity or identity of deaf people. The first one would be deaf. So typically that is someone who would use sign language quite often, historically, and they say, yes, I am a deaf person. This is my primary identity. A second identity is the hearing identity. So even though this person has perhaps cochlear implants or hearing aids and they need that technology to be able to listen and communicate, they still are trying to fit in to the hearing world. There's bicultural identity being the third one, in which that you might have deaf and hearing identity. And the fourth one, and most concerning of all, objectively, is what you might term marginal or negative identity. I see this in my job, and I work with kids in high schools in particular, in upper primary school age, who reject their deafness, do not want anything to do with being deaf, and do not want to grapple and engage with that identity, and instead say, I'm just like everyone else. I'm normal. The problem with that is that they have diminished access. They need specific accommodations and access accommodations to be able to access the curriculum, for their communication partners to effectively communicate with them and connect with them. So this denial of deaf identity can lead to psychological problems. I don't have time to go into all that tonight, but it is a very real concern. So pleasingly, from my point of view, 8 of the 10 did identify as deaf. Now, they didn't identify as capital D deaf, as I outlined earlier, because most of them were using spoken language. Well, sorry, I should say all of them use spoken language as their primary mode of communication. There were a couple of them who did use a little bit of sign language, but for all 10 of them, spoken language was the key mode of communication. So in line with this idea of marginal or negative deaf identity is perhaps this other theme that has emerged from the study of negative self-perceptions. So, and a sense of difference. So the participants, the adolescents, spoke about perhaps being misunderstood. This is a vulnerable age, and we need to be careful about inferring too much from these 10 cases, because adolescence is a time when everyone is grappling for identity. Erickson would tell us that is a key task of an adolescent, develop identity. But for these young deaf adolescents, there's an extra complexity there for them as well. The concept here of, just go back, sorry about that. There was insufficient bridging social capital leading to a disengagement with what it means to be deaf. And this is where the role of social capital really comes in strongly. The idea of connecting with other people and other groups and being understood and accepted by those groups, which is going to lead to a positive deaf identity. As I mentioned, this does start early, and this Cunnan study here outlines how it does start at an earlier age for deaf preteens and adolescents. It is going to involve, from a social capital point of view, access to the deaf community. Now, that might be the capital D deaf community, it might be deaf mentors. There's a whole range of meanings here, but it's not unusual in Sydney, and Sydney is a big place, but it's not unusual for to have one or two deaf adolescents in a high school. It's quite isolating, and it's not unusual to not come across another deaf adolescent. Certainly that was my experience growing up many years ago as well. I want to talk about this idea of briefly embodied social capital, which in many ways kind of borrows from cultural capital as well. So the idea of embodied social capital is the intersection of the individual social and cultural capital. So as social capital develops, cultural capital or understanding of myself, my body, is a positive thing. This deafness that I have, which is one part of me, speaking from the adolescent and indeed my own point of view, is something to be celebrated. It's not something that I need to hide. So I think the idea, that concept of embodied social capital is important there as well. One last thing there, in terms of developing that positive identity through social capital, what that is going to lead to is positive self-advocacy. So when we work with young babies, we are advocating for them. But as soon as they can crawl and walk and whatever, we are starting on that journey to independence until later in high school, and certainly as young adults, we want these young deaf people to be independent. We want them to be advocating for their own access needs. And that might, from a pragmatic social communication perspective, that might look like if a communication breakdown happens, which it does with anyone who has hearing loss, regardless of how good a listener you are, do you have the ability to repair that communication, which is a really important pragmatic communication skill? The opposite of that, and something that I have a research interest in, is stigma. So the way I see it, if you don't have positive social capital and that you have diminished social networks and you don't have a positive view of your own deafness, that is essentially stigma. And that is linked in with the idea of a marginal deaf identity, very isolated. You don't fit into hearing or deaf, higher incidence of mental health negative outcomes, and that is not a good place to be. The last slide here, which I'll quickly run through, is the teacher of a deaf as a bridge. So in Australia, most teachers of a deaf would be in an itinerant role, such as myself. This is a really critical role that we have of bringing top-down social capital. One of the things I love about the conception of social capital is that it's not just about putting it back on the child or the adolescent and the family. It's not just saying to them, you need to listen more, you need to be on the front foot with all the technology, you need to be up advocating for yourself. And those things are really important, don't get me wrong. But social capital also looks at a top-down point of view. So looking at a systemic level, from a school, from the teacher of a deaf, and from a legislation point of view as well.
I will go through the second study. This particular study is available open access. If you are interested, you can go to the American Annals of the Deaf and search social capital, or you can search my name. So the title of this particular paper was The Role of Social Capital in the Transition to Post-Secondary Education of Students who are Deaf or Hard of Hearing. Our research question was simple. It was, what social capital resources influence deaf or hard of hearing students' aspiration toward an attainment of post-secondary education? So what we did, I will leave it to you to read the article because it's open access. But essentially, our methodology was to recruit university students who were deaf or hard of hearing. As you recall, very few students who are deaf or hard of hearing enter university and employment as well. So we recruited deaf students at universities across Australia, and we asked them a series of questions related to the resources, their experiences in high school. In other words, what resources did they have available to them that facilitated their enrollment in university? And the data fell in a very neat ecological format. So they talked about themselves as the individual, their family support, their school support, and their community support. I'll go through those each briefly. They also identified two barriers to social capital: reluctance and limiting attitude. Here is just a figure of our thematic hierarchy. I will go through a few of these, not all of them, but again, you can retrieve the article open access. So deaf communities, so the facilitators at the community level were Deaf Connections. So these university students expressed a strong desire and a strong benefit. They expressed a strong benefit of having proximity with other deaf young people when they're in high school. Most of them went to a deaf camp, which is common in Australia. Different school systems will organize a deaf camp. And because these deaf high school students, these were university students, but they're reflecting on when they were in high school, most of them, all of them, if I remember correctly, were the only deaf person in the high school. I think one of the participants had a sibling who was also deaf. And so having a proximity to other deaf people was extremely valuable for many different reasons, not the least of which It helped them feel that they were part of a community. What they were experiencing was not in isolation of other people. There is in Australia a mentoring service that most of the young people spoke about. That mentoring service is called Here For You. We did not ask them specifically about Here For You, but it continuously came up in the conversation that they found an extreme benefit from having a deaf mentor who was slightly older than they were to talk about and enhance their attitudes toward deafness and future possibilities. They talked about paid and volunteer work. Now, we all know that high school students don't love to work. They love to party and they love to be with their friends. But these university students were interesting insofar as they said, regardless if it was volunteer work or paid work, the experience of work expanded their social network and grew their social capital. They learned many things in the volunteer working or paid workforce. They learned what they were good at, what perhaps they should avoid in other careers. And so they spoke highly of working during high school, just part-time, few hours a week was all that was required. Structured, this is still at the community level, so we're working our way into the individual ecological systems analysis here. So structured non-school activities were very beneficial to these university deaf students. It helped them again to build connections and to practice networking skills. So things like dancing, music, yoga, sports teams, sports clubs, and church. Those out of school activities, again, help them to build and understand how to navigate groups and individual people. Teachers were extremely important to this cohort of students that were participants in our study. Most of the participants reported that their high school teachers were influential and held very high expectations for them. And frequently, nearly all of the participants talked about one specific teacher in their lives when they were in high school who made an enormous influence, positive influence on them when they were making their post-school decision making, when they were involved in that post-school decision-making process. So there was one teacher in the school who helped them understand what perhaps they could do. So that teacher was a resource to them that was very valuable. Career guidance personnel, not all of our participants had career guidance personnel. Some of the participants had individual career guidance, and some had group career guidance. And some of the schools, because many of the participants were in regional Australia, many of those schools didn't have the resource of a career guidance personnel and a teacher that was interested in that particular child act as a career guidance personnel, but very helpful to the university deaf students in understanding expectations for entering university. Peers were very influential, as you should imagine. I'm sure of it. Peers are very important to all of us, but particularly adolescents. So they were in with this cohort. Remember, these are young deaf people who have managed to get into university largely because they had the resources available to them. They had that social capital that had built up for them. Most of the participants also had friends who aspired to attend or enroll in university. So peers were a huge influence. So we started at the community, now we're at the school, and in the school, the peers were very influential. School-related work experience in Australia, in year 10, we have typically 2 weeks where the students in year 10 go out on a placement and they experience one or many different work environments. And again, this was similar to the paid work or voluntary work of the students. Our students in this study found it really helpful to do that workplace experience, exposed them to potential career options. They assisted them in developing their confidence. Perhaps some of them entered into the year 10 structured workplace setting, work experience, with less confidence. But as they progressed in that experience, their confidence grew, helping them to understand what a potential vocational choice could be with them. And then again, remember, when you place a child or an adolescent into a school-related work experience, you're sort of forcing them to develop social networks and to grow their social capital. Parents were very important, so community, school, now we're getting down to the family. So the students in this study said that the parents were very involved in helping them decide what their post-school options were. Extended families played a very important part to them, helping them make decisions. That's the granny, grandpa, aunts and uncles. The benefit of the family seemed to be more at a bonding social capital level, providing the resources to that particular child or young adult that they wouldn't have otherwise experienced. And at the individual level, our participants were highly motivated. Now, perhaps they were highly motivated because they had these resources available to them, or because through their development of networking skills and experiences, volunteering, work, school placements, etc., they grew that motivation. Quite a few of them were actually motivated because they wanted to help other deaf people, which was very interesting, of course. And even many of them went into service or were studying service professions, such as audiology. So the individual, their early interests were strengthened through the social capital resources that they accessed through that ecological model, through their teachers, their families, the work experience, and their community endeavors. There were two barriers. One was reluctance, and Tim sort of spoke about this a little bit. Participants described being reluctant to appear different. Now, that is not atypical for an adolescent. The goal of an adolescent is to be the same as every other adolescent. But it's absolutely tricky if you're an adolescent with a disability. And so there was a strong desire not to appear different from other adolescents. So they did not want to disclose their hearing loss. And of course, like Tim said, if you don't disclose your hearing loss, then you are limiting the resources that potentially could help you, that could support your endeavors to get into university or employment. And the second barrier was a limiting attitude. Participants had what they described as they were worried, they felt that their deafness was an obstacle. So they expressed notions of self-doubt, which causes me to feel a great deal of sadness. And I think it's something that we in the profession of deaf education can work with our young adolescents on, helping them to understand that deafness is a part of diversity and is a part of our world. So our participants express limiting attitudes from other people, not just from themselves, internally, externally, people discouraging them because of their hearing loss. The second paper is in the same journal, the American Annals of the Deaf. It is also open access. And so what we did is we brought the participants back after a number of months, and we asked them a series of questions. Our research question for this part of the study was, from the perspective of young deaf adults in university, how can teachers, other professionals, and families support deaf and hard of hearing adolescents to develop social capital and help them to achieve positive post-secondary outcomes? So in other words, our participants were telling us what teachers, families, professionals, and the deaf high school students should do themselves. And here's our thematic hierarchy. You can read the article if you'd like this. I think it's quite beautiful, actually. But if you'd like to read the article, it'll go into more detail on the theme hierarchy. So I'm going to jump straight to the results in the interest of time. And so, of course, they went right back to this ecological model. We didn't push them in an ecological sense, but they went back to it. So they said that fostering community connections. Now, how social capital is that in itself? I'm going to read a couple of the quotes just to benefit you. One participant said, well, give them social capital. We did not teach them about social capital. I mean, you've got to foster those connections. It's almost like compound interest, honestly. The earlier you start, they foster more connections. And through those connections, they earn life skills, they earn confidence, and they earn real direct support networks, no matter what. Now, how perfect is that? Another fostering social connections quote. I won't read a whole lot of quotes, but these are a couple of my favorites. This one is sort of like a run-on sentence. There should be a few full stop. Apparently, they didn't learn how to stop a sentence, but that doesn't matter. It's the content of the sentence that's important. So one of the participants said, I think the more you try to get in contact with, whether it's friends or people you meet down the street, or if you meet them at a club, as in like a social thing, you are bound to find people that can help you out and who can suggest ways to help you get into the workforce, to help you get into university, and also having those people around you will make you feel included within society as well. And the more you feel included, the more you're bound to be involved in the community as well. So well done to that participant for that statement. Deaf Connections came up again. So interesting that Deaf Connections is important to these deaf high university students. Again, most of them were the only deaf person in their high school. Deaf Connections included interactions with deaf or hard of hearing peers and connections through role models. Participants felt that having connected with deaf or hard of hearing peers or role models was helpful to them as grew their sense of self and their identity. Participants emphasized the benefits they gained from being involved in formal mentoring programs for youth, deaf and hard of hearing youth. They also said, in terms of Deaf Connections, online was fine for them because remember, these participants were all across Australia. So online was fine for these young people. They felt it reduced the travel burden. And so it was all good. Participants saw a role for the schools. They thought it was the school's responsibility. If they were the only deaf student in the school, they thought the school was responsible for connecting them with other deaf people, deaf youth in other areas. The participants spoke about self-acceptance. Remember, it was a limiting attitude, a limiting barrier as well. They spoke about the importance of deaf and hard of hearing youth embracing feelings comfortable with their deafness. And this participant said, if you feel good about yourself and understanding that deafness is who you are, then it will help you with all those other things like finding a job and university and stuff. And so what they're telling us in the first study is that they didn't have that in the first study when they're in high school. But upon reflection, when they were in university, they're saying to these high school students, you really need to grow your self-acceptance. And I think there's a whole network of ways that we can do that with peer support, mentoring, families, etc. So they spoke about the benefits of camp and all of those wonderful things by putting them in close proximity with other deaf people. Again, on self-acceptance, they talked about the need to normalize deafness. Their words, not mine. Open up that conversation and destigmatize it, deafness. Maybe if it were talked about more, and even with just kids, friends, and other peoples in the school, then I would have probably been more accepting of help, even from learning support. I think a lot of it was peer pressure, peer difference. So helping the high school student to develop their self-acceptance upon reflection was important to these university students. Nearly finished. Preparation for post-secondary education. Participants said that it is the role of the school to prepare the deaf high schooler for post-secondary education, and that they should do things like explain to the high school students that when you get to university, there'll be a support network there for them. So explicit preparation for post-secondary education or employment was important. Again, they spoke about the importance of paid and volunteer work experience, sort of nudging those adolescents to get into the workforce. Again, university preparation was a big one. School personnel should explain, as I mentioned, the support that would be available to deaf or hard of hearing students before entering universities. And so they felt, one participant said teachers and career advisors should set them up with a guidance officer at university before they left high school, so that when they decide what university they want to go to, they're already connected to that university. And of course, parents, you have to convince the families to help the kid really get out there, get out of their comfort zone, get them to do volunteer work, get them into employment, get them into non-school activities. They are the ones who have a great influence on the kids' attitude and how they feel about their own hearing loss or deafness. Extended family, so aunts and uncles, grandparents, cousins, all of those people build that bonding social capital. They can all play a role. And of course, peers. Have friends in older year groups and talk about their options and what they're planning and what you want to do and how it's possible. So again, that's a peer. It's both. It could be either a peer-to-peer support or peer or mentor. So usually a mentor is a little bit older, not always, most of the time, but not always. But I'm trying to tell these university students, we're telling the high school students, have friends, talk to the kids who are just a year or two older than you are, find out what they do, what are their plans, see if you can learn from them. Now, just very briefly, 2 little slides on this, just to let you know what our next research project one that we're trying to seek funding for, and it's supporting deaf adolescents post-secondary transition through building social capital. The research is going to be, probably depending on how many participants we have, a prospective crossover mixed method study of young deaf adults with data collected both in Australia and Ireland. The reason why we're collecting it in both countries is that Ireland has Dublin City University, fingers crossed, has a fantastic virtual reality lab. And so virtual reality will be structured to facilitate social capital development. So what we expect to do is build scenarios that we will use the scenarios in the virtual reality so the deaf young person, they'll be young adults in this particular study, can practice building connections with other people. The virtual reality will give them feedback in terms of how they are doing that. And it will also give them an opportunity to try different employment structures, to practice their speaking, communicating, networking. We're going to do, beg your pardon, we're looking to do various assessments as a baseline and repeated measure, including social capital, pragmatics, and family network analysis.
Thank you. To summarize, the buffering effect of social capital comes through in a number of ways. So it leads to opportunities to develop language, particularly pragmatic language, broader networks leading to academic achievement and access to university and career opportunities. The approach complements traditional approaches to developing language and academic outcomes. We're not throwing that approach out. This is to augment that, but it does recognise that facilitating access for deaf adolescents and deaf youth isn't simply a matter of bridging that language and academic gap. There's another component to it which we need to use social capital for.
Mm-hmm.
And deaf cultural and social capital leads to a decrease of stigma and an increase of self-advocacy. And from when we look at Bourdieu, from his perspective, I think you would label that as increased cultural capital. So we have increased social capital leading to an increase of cultural capital, which hopefully eventually will lead through to economic capital, leading through to increased participation in further education and careers. And my last point here, when we think of social capital, a lot of what we're doing, and both Jill and my research focused on the deaf individuals themselves, but we need to also recognise that social capital, there's an organisational component to it as well. It's not just about the individual self-advocating. It's about the attitudes, or what Bourdieu might term habitus. It's that way that we view this group of people, not just what we say, because all developed nations now have wonderful diversity statements, and that's a good thing, but we need to see that flow through in the actions as well, and the unspoken attitudes.
And so if you would like a copy of the references that we have cited in this presentation, or if you'd like a copy of the slide deck, you can email either Tim or me. And if you just go to the University of Newcastle website, you can find our contact details. And finally, in one paper, the publisher did this fantastic figure that I just thought was brilliant. It's in Duncan et al. 2023. And I think it really depicts social capital in a perfect way. So thank you very much for allowing us the opportunity to share our research with you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Wonderful. Thanks for the presentation, Jill and Tim. It's really fascinating to see the work that you're doing, particularly the views and the experiences of young people, and just the way in which they're experiencing and the way they're talking about social capital. They seem to know about the concept, well, the importance of it, even if they're not using the term. And I think that that's really encouraging to see. So we'll have questions from the audience. Feel free to either raise your hand within Zoom. You'll find that under the reactions tab within Zoom. Otherwise, you can simply post in the chat, and when I call upon you, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. If you're unable to ask the question yourself because of language or whereabouts you are in the world, please feel free to let me know, and I'd be happy to read out the question from the chat on your behalf. So I might take the first question. I see there's already one in the chat, but I'll take the first question if you don't mind. I thought it was really interesting the way you talked about stigma. And when I think about social capital from a collective point of view, I often think about how the prejudices that people hold within society is perhaps indicating diminished or less social capital, because the attitudes towards specific types or classes or characteristics of individuals are negative. That's what prejudices ultimately mean. And so therefore that's looking from a collective point of view on the ways in which those kinds of attitudes shape social capital in a negative way. But it seems like stigma and stigmatisms perhaps are more defined by the individual. Like it's perhaps their own sense of self-worth
I
that
can
is the
offer
driving
a
factor.
comment here if you like, Tristan.
Yeah, sure.
So I'm in the very beginning stages of, I'm hoping to publish a review article on stigma and deafness, but I'm very far from finishing that research. But I think we need to acknowledge there's many ways stigma can be defined, but broadly speaking, there's two ways, same as we define identity. So identity comes from how we view ourselves and how other people view us and what groups we're part of. Stigma is similar. So we can have an internal view of stigma, and that is our perception of how other people perceive us. And particularly those with what I mentioned as having a marginal identity, not having a deaf or a hearing identity, they would typically have a negative view of themselves, and perhaps an exaggerated view, in my opinion, working with individuals who might be viewed as having a marginal identity. However, Goffman was the architect of stigma in the 1960s, and his book on stigma is still referenced today. But there has been a further development of stigma, and Goffman doesn't really recognize stigma as an organizational concept. And the concept of discrimination really goes hand in hand with stigma. The difficult thing is it's not always overt discrimination. So as I said, I think it's quite easy these days to come up with policies and procedures that would indicate that stigma and discrimination is illegal. But it's harder in practice really to make that happen in an authentic way. And that might be slightly controversial, but that's certainly my opinion. And that's what I've seen in some of the research as well. It can be a bit hard to put your finger on, but that organisational stigma or discrimination, structural discrimination, is certainly there in times.
I think you make a good point about it being both ways, that it's the perception the individual has about themselves, but it's also the perception that others have of them. And that's where prejudice is, I guess, the way that I would understand the word prejudice, at least, it would be that it's the way that others view me or view the individual, not necessarily how the individual views themselves. And I think one of the final slides you talked about social capital leading to less stigma, positive identity and less stigma. And I guess I wonder about the relationship the other way around, that less stigma as in a better self-identity, which I think you talked about as well, leading to greater social capital, which then in turn perhaps leads to less stigma. Like it perhaps as a flow, a feedback loop.
True, Tristan. I think the other way around is true as well, in terms of when we talk about Putnam's interpretation of bridging social capital, that's also people who have different values and different cultural experiences having an understanding of each other. So if we have a larger majority group of people who are typically hearing and a minority group of people who are deaf, then that bridging social capital is going to lead to the majority group understanding the experiences of the minority group, which is going to destigmatize the situation as well.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think a lot of it comes down to those, what I would describe as shared understandings there, where we view others, we find commonalities with others rather than differences with others, and we understand and appreciate, while identifying and seeing those commonalities, we also appreciate and understand those differences, but we don't see them as a barrier against social action, social participation, social inclusion. And so that a lot of that just comes down to the attitudes of the individuals involved. And of course, the key with any of this is through exposure and communication and interaction and setting the example about what is and isn't appropriate in various circumstances. You know, clearly prejudices tend to produce very negative outcomes. And of course, the word stigma has is very closely associated with the idea of prejudices. The work you're doing sounds extremely interesting. I'd be certainly interested to follow up with how you go with that. So let's turn to the chat. There was a question from Tracy. Of course, feel free to unmute yourself, but your question is simply that you mentioned there is evidence of NDIS supported access to deaf camps and mentoring. And can you share where I'd find this?
Sure. And so if the deaf or hard of hearing young person has access to NDIS, which most do, the criteria for accessing NDIS is very broad for deaf and hard of hearing people. You can actually request it through your planner, that it be one of the items that you purchase with your allotted funding. Do you know anything other than that, Tim?
I think it would typically be in the social participation component, and programs like Here For You run would certainly be eligible for that. And there are online programs as well. They're not all face-to-face, so that's quite useful for people in regional and rural areas.
It's a great way to use that funding because it has an ongoing positive influence, typically from what we understand from our participants. So I would encourage that.
Yeah, okay. There's another question in the chat from Madeline Locke. Feel free to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sorry, I couldn't work out how to raise my hand. So hearing about the studies today, I've just noticed that they've mostly been conducted with kind of deaf people who use spoken English as their main form of communication. And I was wondering how well these findings or like kind of these barriers and successes apply to those of the deaf population that mostly use signed modalities, whether it be Auslan or other kind of signed English or different things like that. I'm just wondering how that kind of applies.
Great question. Do you want to start, Tim, or should I?
Yeah, well, let me first say that we did reach out to a number of signing deaf organisations who had networks with people, capital D deaf community, and it was not successful. So we reached out to a whole range of organisations. The participants that did respond, it was not by design, it was just a convenient sample. So the clean answer is that I don't know. I don't know whether these would stand up to scrutiny if we turned it on its head and just looked at the capital D signing deaf experience. I honestly can't see how they wouldn't apply. My feeling is that when we look at the identity model, those who call themselves deaf and sign are very rarely in that marginal deaf identity or marginal category. Those people who are in that marginal category are usually people who, and this is a bit of a blanket statement, it's not always true, but are usually someone who is saying, I'm hearing, I'm the same as everyone else. They're not typically people who sign. So that is certainly an advantage of the deaf community. So it may not completely transfer over our findings.
And I would, in both of those papers that I summarized, it says that that is one of our limitations of the study. I think it's important to determine the same, to ask the same questions of signing deaf young adults.
Awesome, thank you.
Great. Next question is from Sao. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yes, I have two questions. The first question is, whose responsibility for deaf people or deaf youth to construct social capital? So the first question, whose responsibility to construct social capital for deaf youth? So for deaf youth, so the first question. Yeah. Second question is, which cost of constructive social capital and how to use social capital to economize their future life and benefits their family, benefits their community, and benefits society. Okay, this is 2 questions. Thank you.
Who's responsible for social capital?
Yeah,
is the first one. I would say all of if you look at that ecological model, I'd say everybody's responsible. But certainly the deaf person themselves must have a locus of control. And they would say the parents have a big role, the school has a big role, and the community is not necessarily responsible. It's the responsibility of the student and the parent, probably in the school, to get them into the community. Do you have a different answer for that, Tim?
No, very similar. The reason why we've chosen adolescence as the youngest age is because that's when independence and breaking away for family starts to begin. So there's less responsibility for younger age groups. But I would say that it's important to note that it's not just the responsibility of the deaf individual and their family, because you can be trying to beat yourself out of a paper bag if everything else in society is pushing back. There has to be some structural change as well at the school level and above, and in all these different structural levels and organizations and government and so on. We didn't look at that in the study. That wasn't the focus. But I do strongly believe that social capital is not just about giving tools to the individual. It's on a systemic level as well.
And
Thank you.
I didn't catch the second question. Did someone catch it?
My question is, second question is, which cost of constructing social capital?
The cost of constructing social capital.
Cost, yeah, cost. Which cost of constructing social capital? Maybe do everything will cost something. Cost time, cost energy, cost money.
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting question.
I don't know the answer to that. Do you, Tim?
Do you understand me? Okay, I say again.
Yep.
Yeah,
I think I
okay.
understood.
I say again. So
in
do
Australia-
everything will cost you something. For example, will cost you time, cost you energy, cost money, and cost other thing to do something. So we construct social capital will cost. So what cost? Which cost? What cost to constructing social capital? Yeah. And how to economize this social capital for their future life and for their family, for society. Okay.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad question. Economically, I think in Australia, the taxpayer bears some of that burden. And that's why in Australia, we have disability packages for families to spend money on early intervention and social participation and so on. I think emotionally, what you're talking about is there is a cost. There is an emotional cost, and you start your day with so much energy, and for a deaf person, their energy depletes at a faster rate, particularly if they're using spoken language, because it requires a lot of resources to concentrate, to listen. There has been scientific studies on this. It's just not my opinion, but the cognitive load is increased on a young deaf person. So you are right. If you are choosing this as an intervention, then you are investing a certain amount of energy into it, and there's an opportunity cost there where you can't do something else. But I can't give you a figure on that, but I understand what you're saying. There is a cost involved in adopting this intervention. But I come back to my earlier point, and I think I'm probably getting a bit boring repeating myself, but it's not just up to the individual to bear that cost. It has to be.
Yes, maybe so you give me social capital have two sections because bond and bridge. So this first is bond and second is bridge. So lever the bond and lever bond. So maybe bond and bridge will cost time, cost energy, cost money, cost other thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
But let me just say, in terms of that cost, you could also do a cost-benefit analysis in terms of putting in this cost when the child is younger is going to lead to better economic outcomes.
Yeah.
That's right, Tim. I totally agree.
So yes, there is initial cost, but the long-term benefit is much greater.
Yeah, of course, not only for deaf people, but for general people, for every people, will do bond and do bridge will cost money, cost
Sure.
time, and cost energy. Yeah,
Yeah.
so social capital is not a cheap capital. Say again, social capital is not a cheap cost, not a cheap capital.
You agree?
Yeah.
Okay.
So not for
Well-
any people, not for any people. So especially for deaf people, because they're difficult to communicate with each other.
I
Understand that? So maybe the difficult, very difficult to communicate with each other. So where bond and bridge is difficult too.
Yes.
Yes.
And that's
So
where the bonding social capital comes in as well. It's really important that you're not just doing this on your own.
yeah, it's very difficult. So where increase their social capital is difficult. So of course, the cost of reconstructing social capital for deaf people is very higher and higher.
Well, perhaps there's
Understand
another
me?
way of looking at
Yeah.
this as well, which is that social capital has often been described as a byproduct of other activities, that we can
Mhm.
deliberately invest
Yeah.
in specific types of activities that build social capital.
Mhm.
But a lot of the reason we have social capital is because we go about our daily lives, our work, our various activities, and we interact with others. And through that process, we build social capital almost incidentally. And the other way to think of it as well is that a lot of these processes that we're talking about have immediate reasons and payoffs for us, immediate benefits that are not financial, but they're still tangible benefits. When we interact with someone, we feel a sense of belonging, we feel good about ourselves, we get validation. There's all sorts of reasons why we engage in social interaction, and many of them are not explicitly a cost. We could think of some of them, sure, as an investment, and maybe we could build more social capital if we went out of our way to spend more time socializing. I guess that's a cost, but so much of how we build social capital is incidental. So I strongly suspect for the context that Jill and Tim are researching, even very small changes to the ways in which schools operate and activities operate that allow for and incorporate deaf people to participate, even through very small changes that don't necessarily cost anything at all, or very, very minimal costs at least, could facilitate the generation of much more social capital. So, I think that there's a perspective there about the source being a byproduct, or at times a deliberate investment.
Well said, Tristan.
Thanks, Jill. So we have a few more minutes, maybe 5 more minutes, if there are any final questions. There's been lots of comments in the chat, positive comments about the presentation, but saying that the participants need to run off for other commitments.
Fair enough.
So any final comments or questions that you would like to share? I have more, but of course, I feel like I've already been asking too many questions.
No, go ahead. We're happy to answer.
Well, I shall, while other people perhaps are thinking of any final questions they want to ask. I'm quite interested in the point you made earlier at near the very beginning, which was where you were talking about the difference between Putnam and Bourdieu's theories of social capital. And I think very accurately you described Bourdieu's approach, seeing social capital as effectively a finite resource, that if you have social capital, it's because of your position in social status, in the social hierarchy, whether it's status or prestige or wealth or power or whatever it might be. And this is, of course, quite different from the way Putnam sees it, which is more of almost a universal resource, because of course you can always know more people, you can always have more stronger norms, stronger trust, greater solidarities, greater social identity. And so I'm curious, without there being a very specific question, but I'm curious as to if you could talk about how you think Bourdieu's theories add value to the way in which you think about and understand social capital.
I think the main way they add value, and this is not strictly part of the research, but in terms of my own thinking about the issues, and you've probably heard this come out in some of my answers, in that I see Bourdieu's definition of capitals, because as we know, he didn't really say a lot about social capital. It was clothed in a whole discussion about capitals, is essentially about breaking down some of these barriers, and it's an acknowledgement of inequities in society. So Bourdieu was writing about French education in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or even before that, but we can transfer that context to deaf education today, and indeed further into deaf outcomes. So in some ways, I see it as an emancipatory approach in a way, in trying to break down those barriers. And it's a way of viewing the world in a political way, really, a way of viewing power. Because traditionally, people who are deaf and people with disability more broadly have not been empowered. So using some of Bourdieu's analysis, not just with capitals, with habitus and so on, that we didn't use in our research, but certainly I'm aware of, is a really nice way to conceive of the field changing, and the way people are viewed in even an unconscious, unthinking way is changed. And I've seen that in my lifetime in the way that people who are deaf are viewed in a more positive way, I would say, than when I was growing up. I still think we have some way to go, but I'm not sure when I've quite answered your question there, Tristan, but I hope that's somewhat helpful.
No, I think you have answered the question, because I was just looking for that kind of insight as to where you think it has value, because it does seem to have a lot of value. And it's always great to see when researchers bring it in and aim to incorporate particularly that idea of unequal access to social capital that Bourdieu's approach emphasizes. You know, the Putnam approach tends to be that universality, that it floats all boats, it's available to everyone, but of course it isn't. You know, there's lots of differences between individuals.
I think in terms of our research, Putnam's language of bonding and bridging was just invaluable to the analysis. Even though I personally prefer Bourdieu's conception of social capital, I think Putnam's the language and terminology that he brings into it are incredibly useful in breaking it down.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, like, when I look at your conceptualization overall, you've got that nice simple distinction of bonding and bridging, but you're going much, much deeper than that. You know, a lot of your analysis is based on Bourdieu and based on unequal access and those underlying principles and qualities that are clearly so important, which is, of course, as I mentioned, is great to see.
Thanks.
All right, so we really do only have a couple of minutes left. So any final questions before we wrap up? Looks like everyone's exhausted their questions. So thanks very much, Jill and Tim. We really appreciate it. We know how much time it takes to prepare and to give a webinar. So we really do appreciate it on behalf of all of the members. Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
So I have a question, and maybe not a question, maybe I start my suggestion. So because we will transfer the education to education economicals, so we will research the economically and results of deaf people, deaf project, and deaf community. Yeah. So maybe education economical is the education and economical integrated with each other.
So how do education and the economic link in together? Well, I think from a traditional...
This is my suggestion. Yeah.
So if you don't mind me answering, Jill, just jump in for
No.
Okay. It comes down to, with deaf students, diminished access to speech, if we're taking a spoken language approach, is traditionally going to lead to lower language, which is going to lead to lower academic performance, which is going to lead to lower university participation, which is going to lead to lower participation in the workforce. That's what that's the economic component there. So if I
maybe
could,
in your paper, you will give some investigation or some interviews to increase their apologies and this stigma and etc. So I think you will transfer the social capital to economic capital, and how to use this social capital to benefit their life and increase their income, increase their living standard, and increase their living level. Of course, increase their income of their life. So this is the benefit and outcome of social capital. Yeah.
Right.
So
Right.
education. This is education. This is the result of the education of deaf people or deaf youths. Yeah. It's my suggestion. Yeah. Only for your recommendation. Yeah.
so if I understand you correctly, you're looking for the link between social capital, increasing social capital, and increasing economic outcomes?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, I think Bourdieu is very helpful here in terms of it's an unnatural thing in some ways to break capital down to social, economic, cultural, because when we see social capital improve, at the same time, cultural capital is improving as well. For example, your cultural capital could be you have a university degree or you have a certain title, and having that increased cultural capital is generally going to be associated with increased economic capital.
Yeah.
Okay, so those three things are moving at the same time. So I know in academia and research we separate the three concepts, but naturally they do occur concurrently.
Okay, thank you.
No, that makes sense. No, good to get in that final question. So thanks again, Jill and Tim. Let's wrap it up and leave it there.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for your time.
Yeah. Good.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.